17 times. I counted because counting was easier than feeling anything else. My mother said it 4 times, each one a little louder than the last, like she needed the volume to make it true. My sister managed 5, delivered with the practiced calm of someone who had rehearsed this in her car on the way over. My Uncle Walter, who had not contributed a single dollar to anything in this family since the Clinton administration, found 3 separate ways to say it. Even Marcus, my younger brother, who usually stayed quiet at these dinners and let other people do the bleeding, looked up from his plate long enough to add his own. Selfish. Apparently that was the word for a man who didn't want to finance a 400-person wedding for a cousin he saw twice a year. I didn't say anything. I picked at the green beans my mother had overcooked the way she always overcooked them, soft and gray, and I let the word land on me again and again like rain on a roof. You stop hearing individual drops after a while. You just hear the weather. Nobody at that table knew where the money for my mother's heart specialist had come from 3 years earlier. Nobody knew why the mortgage on this house, the one we were currently sitting in, eating off plates I'd replaced after the divorce settlement ate the good china, had never once gone to foreclosure despite 2 years of my mother being unable to work. I knew I had always known. I had simply never told them, because at the time it hadn't occurred to me that not telling them would someday be mistaken for not doing it at all. My mother set her fork down with the specific delicacy of a woman about to deliver something she considered wisdom. "Family helps family," she said. "That's all we're asking." I looked at her for a long moment, long enough that Claire shifted in her seat, the way people do when silence makes them nervous. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I had learned over the better part of a decade that defending yourself to people who have already decided who you are accomplishes nothing except giving them a clearer target. Some truths don't need to be spoken out loud. Some truths just need paperwork. But to understand how I ended up at that table, accused of a crime I'd spent 10 years quietly preventing, I have to go back. Long before the wedding, long before the dinner, long before anyone in my family had a reason to use the word selfish at all. I was 26, the first time my mother called me at 2 in the morning. I almost didn't pick up. I had a client presentation in 6 hours, and I remember staring at the phone buzzing on the nightstand, the screen lighting up the dark of my apartment, thinking it could wait until morning. It couldn't. Nothing involving my mother's voice cracking on the other end of a line was ever something that could wait. "It's your father," she said, not crying yet. Past crying, somehow, in that flat, exhausted register people use when the worst thing has already happened, and they're just now finding the words for it. He'd had a heart attack in the garage. He didn't make it to the hospital in time to matter. I don't remember most of the funeral. I remember the casket was more expensive than my mother could afford and somehow got paid for anyway, and at the time I didn't ask how, because I was 26 and grief made me stupid about logistics. I remember my mother standing very straight through the whole service, the way women of her generation are trained to stand straight through things that would break someone else in half. What I remember most clearly is 3 weeks later, finding the second mortgage paperwork on her kitchen table while I was visiting to check on her. She'd taken it out years earlier, back when my father's contracting business had a bad season, and never told anyone. The payments were still due. My father's life insurance had covered the funeral and almost nothing else. I didn't say anything about it that day. I went home, and 2 days later I set up an automatic transfer from my account into hers, just enough to cover the mortgage payment, timed for the 3rd of every month. I never told her. I told myself I would eventually when the timing felt right. The timing never felt right. There's no good moment to tell your grieving mother that you've started quietly managing her finances behind her back, because the conversation implies a kind of failure on her part that I never wanted her to feel. So I just didn't have it. The first time felt like an emergency. By the 3rd month, it felt like routine. By the 1st year, it had stopped feeling like anything at all. It was simply something that happened the way rent happens, the way a gym membership renews whether you go or not. The habit didn't stay contained to one transfer. My sister Claire called 18 months later, her voice doing that thing where it goes thin and brittle right before someone asks you for money they're embarrassed to need. Her son's school had a payment plan dispute. Some clerical error on the district's end had triggered a hold on his enrollment, unless the balance was cleared by Friday. "I wouldn't ask," she said, "but Mark's hours got cut and—" "I'll handle it," I said. I always said I'll handle it. It became a kind of personal motto, 3 words that meant I have already decided this is my responsibility before you've finished the sentence. Then it was Marcus's car. Then it was Uncle Walter's roof. which he insisted was an investment property even though he'd lived in it for 11 years and never once mentioned rental income on a tax return. Then it was utility bills that arrived at my mother's house with red ink on them. Shut-off notices I intercepted before she ever saw them. Because somewhere along the way I had decided that protecting her from financial fear mattered more than protecting my own bank balance. None of this felt like sacrifice while it was happening. It felt like being useful. There's a particular kind of satisfaction in being the person who solves things, who makes the bad letter disappear before anyone else has to read it. I built an entire identity around it without noticing I was doing it. I never sent an invoice. I never mentioned a number. When relatives asked how I was doing, I said fine, works good, and let the conversation move on to whatever crisis they'd actually called about. I didn't realize, not yet, that silence has a half-life. That if you help people quietly for long enough, the silence itself starts to suggest that maybe there was never much help to begin with. The shift was so gradual, I couldn't point to the day it happened. There was a stretch of years where every family gathering came with an undertone, a low electrical hum beneath the surface of normal conversation, where someone needed something, and the only question was whether they'd ask outright or simply create a situation where refusing felt impossible. Claire stopped saying thank you first. I noticed it the way you notice a clock has stopped, not in the moment it happens, but sometime later when you glance at it and realize the hands haven't moved in a while. A school fee got resolved. A car got fixed. No text afterward. No mention at the next dinner. The help had simply become weather. You don't thank the sky for not raining on your wedding day. You just expect clear skies and you get mildly annoyed when, for once, it rains. My mother started saying things like, "Well, you don't have kids, so it's easier for you," when explaining why certain expenses fell to me. I never corrected the math. I never pointed out that easier and possible aren't the same word, that the math worked because I'd built it to work, by living in a smaller apartment than my income could have afforded, by not taking the vacations my coworkers took, by quietly restructuring my own life around a responsibility nobody else in that house could see. Then the story started changing, in a way that had nothing to do with math at all. It happened first at a Sunday dinner I almost didn't attend. Marcus was talking about his promotion, riding the high of it, and at some point, the conversation drifted toward who in the family had really stepped up over the years. He said it casually, like it cost him nothing. I mean, I helped Mom out more than people think. Daniel's good with the big stuff, sure, but day-to-day, who's actually there? Claire nodded along, not maliciously. I want to be fair about that. I don't think either of them set out to erase a decade of transfers and quiet phone calls and bills paid before anyone saw the late notice. I think it's simpler and somehow worse than malice. I think when you don't see something happen, your mind quietly fills the gap with a story where you were the one who mattered. Marcus believed what he said. That's what made it impossible to argue with. I sat there with my water glass and said nothing, the way I always said nothing, and somewhere in that silence the official family history shifted half a degree off true north. Nobody noticed the correction happening. I'm not sure I noticed it fully myself, not then. I just remember feeling something settle in my chest that hadn't been there before. Not anger exactly. Something quieter and more permanent than anger. The first sediment of a resentment I wasn't ready to name. The wedding request arrived on a Tuesday, in the form of a phone call from my mother that began, unusually, with a compliment. "You've always been so generous," she said, and I knew immediately that something expensive was coming, because my mother only led with generosity when she needed to spend mine. My cousin Whitney was getting married. 400 guests. A venue with a name that sounded like a hotel chain trying to sound like a vineyard, and a budget that had apparently been built without anyone checking whether the money to support it actually existed. "Her parents can't cover the difference," my mother said. And I thought, well, you've always wanted to be more present for the family. This would mean so much. I asked how large the difference was. The number she gave me was not a wedding gift. It was a down payment on someone else's house, dressed up in white lace and string lights. "I can't do that," I said. There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that isn't really a pause at all but a recalibration. My mother reorganizing her entire approach in real time. "I'm not asking you to do anything you haven't already done before," she said. She had no idea how true that sentence was or how differently it landed than she meant it. I had done things like this before, many times. She simply didn't know it because I'd never told her, and the not telling had finally caught up to me in the worst possible way. It had let her believe that this would be the first time, the one time, the reasonable ask after years of taking and never giving. I said no, I told her gently, the way you'd correct a child who misheard an instruction. I'm sorry, I can't fund the wedding. The silence that followed was longer than the first one. When she finally spoke again, her voice had changed register entirely, gone cool in a way I hadn't heard directed at me before. We'll talk about it Sunday, she said. As a family, I should have understood in that moment exactly what kind of conversation Sunday was going to be. I didn't. I genuinely believed, with a kind of naivety that embarrasses me now, that a decade of quiet sacrifice had purchased me at least the benefit of the doubt. The dinner started normally enough, which in hindsight should have been its own warning. Normal dinners in my family were rare enough to be suspicious. My mother had made the pot roast she always made for occasions she considered important, and for the first 20 minutes everyone talked about Whitney's venue, the flower arrangements, a string quartet someone had found for a price that made my jaw tighten every time it came up. I ate quietly. I let the conversation orbit the topic without landing on it, the way you let weather build before a storm actually breaks, because there's nothing to do but wait. It was Claire who finally said it outright, setting her wine glass down with a small, definitive click. I just think it's worth saying, she said, looking at me directly for the first time all evening, that it feels a little selfish, considering everything. I almost laughed. I didn't because laughing would have required explaining the joke, and the joke was a decade long and entirely invisible to everyone at that table. Selfish how? I said, not a question. A flat repetition giving her room to either clarify or retreat. She didn't retreat. You make good money. This is family, Whitney's family, and you're acting like we're asking you to fund a stranger's vacation. My mother nodded along, the way she'd nodded along with Marcus months earlier. The same quiet, validating tilt of the head that told me this had been discussed before I arrived, that I had walked into a verdict rather than a conversation. We've never asked you for much over the years, my mother said. This is one time. I set my fork down. I want to be honest about what I felt in that exact second, because it wasn't rage, and it wasn't even hurt exactly. It was something closer to vertigo, the specific disorientation of hearing someone describe your own life back to you in a shape you don't recognize, delivered with total sincerity, no malice in it at all, which somehow made it worse. She believed what she was saying. That was the part that found the soft place in my chest and pressed down hard. We've never asked anything from you, she repeated, like the sentence deserved emphasis, like she was being generous by pointing out how rarely she'd burdened me. I looked at her, at the table, at the pot roast going cold under its own steam, at Marcus avoiding my eyes, at Claire's wine glass catching the overhead light. I didn't say anything yet, but somewhere behind my ribs, very quietly, without ceremony or anger or anything that would have shown on my face, a decision was already forming. Not a plan. Not yet. Just the cold, settling certainty that something in this house had to change, and that I was finally, after 10 years, going to let it. Nobody said anything else that night. We finished the pot roast in a silence so complete I could hear the refrigerator cycling on in the kitchen. My mother cleared the plates with a brisk efficiency that meant she was furious and unwilling to admit it. And I drove home with the radio off, replaying her sentence the way you replay a wrong note in a song you used to know by heart. We've never asked anything from you. I didn't sleep much that night. Not from anger. From the strange vertigo of realizing that an entire decade of my life had been rewritten in a single sentence, spoken with total sincerity, by the person it should have been least possible to fool. The calls started 2 days later. My Aunt Pamela, who I spoke to maybe twice a year, phoned to tell me that family means showing up, as though I'd missed a birthday rather than declined to finance a 400-person open bar. Whitney posted something vague on social media about people who forget where they came from when they get a little money. No names mentioned, every name implied. Claire sent a text that read, simply, disappointed, with no further explanation, as if the word alone was supposed to do the work of an argument. I didn't respond to any of it. There's a particular exhaustion that sets in once you've spent 10 years being the solution to other people's problems. You run out of the energy required to defend yourself against people who never noticed you solving anything in the first place. My mother called once on a Wednesday and asked if I'd had time to think about Whitney. I have, I said, and the answer's still no. She sighed in a way that communicated more disappointment than any sentence could have. I just don't understand when you became this person, she said, and hung up before I could ask her which person she meant, or whether she'd ever actually known the other one. That was the moment something finished settling in me. Not rage, Rage would have been easier, would have burned itself out eventually. This was quieter and colder than rage, and it didn't burn out. It just sat there, patient, waiting for me to act on it. I didn't make an announcement. I didn't write anyone a letter explaining my feelings, because I'd learned by then that explanations only work on people willing to hear them. And nobody at that table had shown any sign of wanting to listen. I simply opened my banking app on a Thursday night, scrolled through a decade of recurring transfers I'd set up so long ago I sometimes forgot they existed, and canceled them. All of them. The mortgage assistance, the utility backstop, the standing transfer that had quietly covered my mother's supplemental insurance premium since my father died. I didn't tell anyone. I'd had a decade of practice at not telling anyone things. It turned out to be just as easy to apply the skill in reverse. The first sign of trouble took 3 weeks to surface, which told me something about how thin the margins had actually been the whole time, how close to the edge everyone had been living without ever once looking down. My mother called, her voice carrying a confusion that hadn't been there in the disappointed phone calls of the previous month. "I don't understand," she said. "The mortgage company called. They said there's a payment past due. I've never missed a payment in my life." I let that sit for a second longer than was comfortable. "That's strange," I said. "I called the bank. They said everything looks normal on my end, that there must be some kind of processing error." She sounded rattled in a way I hadn't heard since the week my father died. "I don't even understand how the math works anymore. The numbers don't add up the way they used to." "I'm sure it'll sort itself out," I said, and I meant the words technically, if not in the spirit she was hoping for. I didn't help her sort it out. I want to be honest about that, because I'm not interested in pretending this part of the story was comfortable for me. It wasn't. There's a version of me that wanted to drive over that same night and fix it quietly, the way I'd fixed everything for 10 years, because the habit doesn't die just because you've decided to kill it. But I didn't go. I sat in my apartment and let the discomfort exist without resolving it, which was its own kind of unfamiliar labor. The second month was worse, and not just for my mother. Marcus's car, the one I'd quietly covered 2 separate repairs on without him ever knowing where the sudden warranty extension had come from, broke down again. And this time there was no warranty, extended or otherwise, because I'd let that account lapse along with everything else. Claire's son hit another billing snag at school, except this time nobody intercepted it before the notice reached her directly, and she found out for the first time that these near misses had been happening for years without her ever once needing to handle one herself. The family did what families do when the floor they didn't know they were standing on starts to give way. They turned on each other. Marcus accused Claire of borrowing against their mother's house without telling anyone. Claire accused Uncle Walter of never paying anything back, not once in 11 years. Walter, for his part, insisted the missing money had to be a bank error, because surely, nothing had actually changed. Nobody called me. I want to note that, because it tells you something about how invisible the help had truly been. 10 years of quietly catching falling objects, and when the objects finally hit the ground, not one person thought to ask whether the hand that used to catch them had simply opened. The discovery, when it came, had nothing to do with me at all. My mother's health took a turn that fall, nothing catastrophic, but enough that she and my siblings decided sensibly to get her affairs in order. A lawyer was retained. Estate documents needed updating, and that meant financial records needed reviewing, going back further than anyone had originally intended. Because the lawyer kept asking questions about gaps in the paperwork that didn't make sense without context nobody in the room could provide. I wasn't there when it happened. Claire told me about it afterward, her voice strange on the phone, careful in a way it had never been careful with me before. The lawyer had pulled 10 years of transaction history while reconciling the mortgage account, trying to understand a decade of payments that came from an account that wasn't my mother's, rooted in through a financial pattern too consistent to be coincidence, and too quiet to be anything but deliberate. "There's a name on all of it," Claire said. "It's yours, every transfer, the mortgage, the insurance, Mom's specialist bills from 3 years ago, my kid's school thing from Daniel, it goes back to when Dad died." I didn't say anything for a moment. "I figured someone would find it eventually," I said. "They asked me to come over on a Sunday," which felt almost unbearably fitting, given how many Sundays had already been spent at that table deciding things about me without me. The documents were spread across the same surface where the pot roast had gone cold months earlier. My mother sat at the head of the table with her reading glasses pushed up into her hair, not wearing them. as if she'd already read everything enough times that the words had stopped needing magnification and started needing something else entirely. Nobody spoke when I sat down. The lawyer, a tired, kind-faced woman named Renata, slid a printed summary toward me anyway, a courtesy I hadn't asked for and didn't particularly need. 10 years, 4 categories: mortgage assistance, medical costs, education expenses, emergency repairs. A number at the bottom that nobody in that room said out loud, because saying it would have made it real in a way the silence, for one more moment, let them avoid. My mother looked at the number, then at me, then back at the number, as if it might resolve into something smaller on a second reading. "This can't be right," she said, but there was no conviction left in it. It was the sound of someone testing whether disbelief still worked as a strategy and finding that it didn't. "It's right," I said. Nobody spoke for what felt like a long time. Claire was the one who finally broke first, her hand pressed flat against her mouth like she was trying to hold something in that had already gotten out. "The school thing," she said. 3 years ago, I thought the district made an error. I thought—" She didn't finish the sentence. There wasn't a version of it that ended anywhere good. Marcus stared at the paper like it had personally insulted him, which in a way it had. "The car," he said quietly, "both times." My mother hadn't moved. She was looking at a single line item, the medical transfer from 3 years back, the one tied to the specialist appointment that had quite possibly kept her alive long enough to be sitting at this table arguing about a wedding she could never have afforded. Her hands, folded in her lap, had started to shake very slightly, the way hands do when the body understands something before the mind has fully caught up. "You let us say those things to you," she said. Not a question, barely even directed at me, more like she was saying it to herself, trying the sentence out to see if it was survivable. "At dinner, you let us call you." She couldn't finish that word either. I noticed she didn't try very hard. "I didn't see the point in arguing," I said. "I figured the truth didn't need my help defending itself. It just needed time." Marcus put the paper down very carefully, like it might tear if he wasn't gentle with it. "I'm sorry," he said. It came out rough, unrehearsed, nothing like the easy confidence he'd had the night he told the whole table he was the one who'd really stepped up. "I didn't know. I should have asked. I never once asked." Claire said it too, quieter, looking at her hands instead of at me. Walter didn't say anything at all, which was its own kind of answer, and I decided I didn't need one from him. My mother was the last to speak, and when she did, her voice had lost the cool register from the dinner months earlier. It had gone back to something I hadn't heard since the week my father died, small and stripped of pretense. "Why didn't you tell us?" she asked. I thought about that question for longer than the silence in the room was probably comfortable with. "Because helping someone shouldn't require an audience," I said. She nodded slowly, like she was trying to accept that as a complete answer, the way you accept whether you can't argue with. "But neither should gratitude," I added. Nobody had anything to say to that. I didn't need them to. 2 years passed before the house felt like a house again, instead of a ledger of unspoken debts. My mother went back to work part-time at the library, something she'd given up wanting to do once dependency had quietly become the default. Marcus started contributing to her expenses directly, in his own name, with his own account, and the first time he mentioned it at dinner, he looked almost proud, the particular pride of someone discovering a muscle they didn't know they had. Claire stopped calling me when things went wrong and started calling the school district herself, which seemed like a small thing until you understood what it had cost her to learn it. Whitney's wedding happened on a smaller budget, at a venue that didn't try to look like anything other than what it was. I went. I gave a gift that was generous but ordinary, the kind any cousin might give, and nobody at the reception called me selfish, not once, not even as a joke. We still have dinner most Sundays. The pot roast is the same. The conversation is different. Lighter in places it used to be heavy, and occasionally honest about money in a way it never used to be, which is its own kind of progress for a family built on the assumption that someone else would always handle it. My mother asked me once more, almost a year after the lawyer's table, why I'd never told her. I think she needed to ask it more than once before she could really hear the answer. I told her the same thing. She was quiet for a while. Then she reached over and put her hand on mine, the way she used to when I was a kid and had done something she was proud of but didn't know how to say out loud. "I'm grateful," she said. "I should have said it a long time ago for all of it." "I know," I said. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, that was enough.